Welcome to Off the Clock, the webcast of employment attorneys at Miller Johnson, where we discuss what is happening in the HR world and provide practical insight and advice. We are your co-hosts, Rebecca Strauss and Sarah Willey, two employment lawyers who spend their days guiding employers through all of the challenges that workplaces offer.
Hi everyone, Sarah and Rebecca here to talk to you today about paid parental leave policies. We've been seeing a lot of questions from clients, a lot of organizations drafting their first policies or perhaps revising old policies. We're going to talk to you about what should be in those policies, what should be out of those policies, and guideposts to help you prepare those policies or revisions to your current policies. Sarah, why do you think we're getting so many questions about this lately?
Yeah, good morning, Rebecca.
Good morning.
Yeah, I've been thinking about that myself because I know over the past several weeks I have seen a lot of paid parental leave policies come my way.
Yeah.
And of course I don't know for sure the why, but I would guess that it has to do with the competitive job market, right? Mm-hmm. Employers looking for ways to set themselves apart from their competitors, and in doing so, they're looking closely at the benefits they provide. Mm-hmm. And this is certainly an example of a benefit that a lot of employers maybe haven't been providing, but are more willing to do so now. And I would also add that before the pandemic, I had also started to see these come across my desk, and I wonder if maybe these might also be projects that were kind of put on hold during the pandemic and are now resurfacing. I don't know. What do you think? What's your opinion?
I completely agree with all of that. Two other things. Instead of setting themselves apart, I think smaller and mid-sized businesses are just trying to keep up with the Joneses at this point.
Well, that's true, too.
I think a lot of larger companies, to your point, before the pandemic, right, had really started boosting parental leave, and specifically for birth and non-birth parents, which is a big change that we'll talk about conceptually. And so I think we're seeing the trickle-down effect, and absolutely, I think things were put on hold during COVID, and now people are getting back at it. I also think perhaps the return to work issue is causing new parents to want additional.
Oh, that's interesting. So maybe employees are driving some of the conversation too, and they're asking questions.
I think maybe there wasn't quite as high of a demand for the leave when they were home with their children, with their new children, but now that they're being required to come back into the office, there's obviously more of an incentive to find some sort of way to get the employer, right, to agree to have them stay home. So it could be a lot of things, but regardless of the cause, we know we're seeing a huge uptick.
We sure are.
So this is something that is happening, and for folks that are listening, if you are not working on a parental leave policy, now you know you probably should be, right?
We're starting to talk about
your competitors,
right.
Even again in the small and mid-sized markets, are now starting to work on these things.
Paid parental leave policies are a bit unique because they are a policy with which an employer provides a benefit, right? Something extra to their employees. And we don't typically see real discrimination concerns with those types of policies, but with paid parental leave policies, employers really need to write those policies very carefully to avoid discrimination concerns, and in particular gender discrimination concerns. You agree with me on that?
That is the first thing clients ask, because we're all concerned about discrimination issues, but and no one intentionally goes into anything, right? Trying to formulate a policy with express discrimination in the policy. But that is always one of the very first things clients ask is, well, can we treat men and women differently? It seems to me this might be one of those scenarios, Rebecca, where we might have to. I mean, how do you do a policy and not treat men and women differently, and are we then opening ourselves up to discrimination if we do? So luckily for everyone, you have cracked the code.
I don't know about that, but I have thought about this a lot.
How to do
this, right?
So how do folks go about crafting a policy that won't be discriminatory?
Right. Okay. So the first thing I would say is we are going to get rid of any verbiage that uses terms like maternity leave and paternity leave.
Those are dated terms.
Those are very dated terms. And also they invite mistakes.
Yes.
Right? So I still frequently see policies that come across and say maternity leave for any reason, for example, is 12 weeks of paid time, and paternity leave for any reason is 6 weeks of time. And the intent behind it, I understand. It usually comes from an assumption that if a woman gives birth to a child, if an employee gives birth to a child, that employee then would take maternity leave, and and that person should get more time off. The problem is that it fails to account for two things, and that is, number one, giving birth is not the only way we bring children into our lives, right? So if this is a policy that is also going to provide time off work for adoption or foster care, right?
Yeah.
That's going to be a problem, right?
Absolutely.
You can't have a policy that says if a woman adopts a baby, she gets more time than if a man adopts a baby. There's really no legitimate basis for doing that. And also it doesn't account for the idea that there can be a same-sex couple. So would that policy say that a woman who didn't give birth but whose partner did gets more time than a man whose partner gave birth? Does that make sense?
Yes.
So those gender terms are very problematic. I tend to use the terms birthing or birth parent.
Birth parent.
And non-birth parent or non-birthing parent, whichever. And if people have other ideas, certainly that's fine too. I didn't write the book on it. But that is a way to convey that an individual who gives birth to a child may get a different amount of paid parental leave, which is perfectly fine.
Okay.
But an individual who didn't give birth to a child gets X amount.
And I think this is an example of that's really what most clients want.
Yes.
They realize there is a difference physically, right, in terms of physical recovery.
Yeah.
Between a person who gives birth to a child and one who does not. It's just based on the assumption that that is always a woman, and when a woman has a child brought into her life, it is always because she gave birth to that child.
That's right.
So it's based on some faulty assumptions. So that's all it is, right? So we're not really changing the outcome, if you will, but changing the thinking about it will then lead us down the correct path as we go down through the rest of formulating the policy.
That's right.
It really helps
That's right.
sort everything out, and all the clouds go away, right?
It really does, yeah. When I make that suggestion to somebody writing a policy to just think about it along those terms and use those terms, it's sort of like the dominoes fall. Like everything else in the way they think about it falls into place under the policy. That's right.
Let's talk about the difference between leave for bonding time versus leave for giving birth to a
recover
child.
from childbirth.
And now that we've set the foundation, the rest of, I think, what you have to say is going to make a lot of sense to everyone. So,
and this is the next question I always have, or topic I talk about with a client who's working on a policy or for whom I'm reviewing a policy, and that's there are different ways that employers can provide employees with pay after recovering from childbirth. Okay? Very frequently, that organization may already be doing that through an STD policy. Right? Because don't forget there's STD benefits, and that's sort of, if this paid parental leave concept is brand new, that's probably how that has been happening, right?
Yes.
An employee gives birth to a child and is eligible for STD benefits to recover from that for a period of time, okay?
Yep.
There are different ways then that business can go at that. I am seeing a lot of organizations that want to provide that pay to the employee who gives birth entirely through the paid parental leave policy. They want to say, if an employee gives birth, they get 100% pay starting from the birth for X period of time.
Without running it through their short-term disability?
Without running it through their short-term disability policy.
What is the motivation for that?
I'm finding it's usually because they want that person to get 100% pay.
I see. And short-term disability, as we know, often is not 100%.
Is often
wage
not,
replacement.
and it feels administratively easier to just pay, to provide this paid parental leave benefit through the paid parental leave policy. And that is certainly an option. You, an organization could do that. The one thing I would say, though, is we probably have to make a change or an amendment to the STD plan.
Ah, good point.
So that those things are working in coordination with each other. That's not hard. Okay. And we've been working with Trip Vanderwell, who's been on Off the Clock before.
Oh yes, one of our favorites.
Yeah, exactly. To do that, and he's great at it. And he usually recommends. I mean, it truly is a sentence or two.
Okay.
To add to the plan or change the plan to reflect that.
Okay.
And when we do that, of course, there could be circumstances in which an employee has a need for STD benefits before they give birth. Sure. That happens sometimes. An employee might be on bed rest,
yep,
for example. And the STD policy would still apply to that.
Okay.
And there could be circumstances in which an employee remains disabled even after they've used up their paid parental leave allotment under the policy, and the STD policy would then apply to that as well. Does that make sense?
Got it. Yes, it does. So for the time that an employer wants to provide leave for a birth parent to physically recover from that event, they can either just pay for it themselves or they can run it through their STD
policy
program.
Yep, that's right.
But that portion of parental leave can be separate from the bonding portion of parental leave.
That's right.
Right? And this is again a concept that's, I think, a little different to parental leave policies from the old-fashioned maternity leave policies where it was just 6 weeks, 8 weeks, 12 weeks, and there was no distinction between the physical recovery and the bonding. When we get to the bonding portion of the leave, that is the same for the birth and the non-birth parent, right?
Yes.
Okay.
That is, from a legal standpoint, that's what I love to see, because that avoids those discrimination concerns.
Yes.
Right?
So the total amount of leave might be different for the birth or non-birth parent, or we could end up making them the same if we wanted to. But if you can make them different and not run into discrimination claims is the bottom line.
Different for a birth parent versus a non-birth parent. That's correct. That's right.
If we add up the total amount of leave, it might end up being different.
So the bonding time, I would love to see the same for a birth parent or non-birth parent. But to your point, a birth parent will probably or could very well end up getting quite a bit more time because they're going to first get time off to recover from the childbirth and then get that bonding time at the back end of that. That's cool.
Okay, Sarah, this is a great time for a little public service announcement break because I bet a lot of people right now are thinking, what about the FMLA?
Well, as they should be.
As you want them always to be thinking.
We should always have a public service announcement regularly about the FMLA. But yes, that is a great point, Rebecca, right? So just a reminder, the FMLA for employers with at least 50 employees, right, requires unpaid time off work, both for birth parents and non-birth parents, right?
But so it does not distinguish.
Unpaid time, right. So employees have their right to take time off under the FMLA, regardless of whether there's a paid parental leave policy in place. And nothing about the paid parental leave policy will change that right to unpaid time off work. Okay, so we are talking with regard to a paid parental leave policy, we are talking about the employer then supplementing that with money, with pay, and creating their own rules as to when an employee has access to that money or that pay.
It's access to the money.
You got it.
It's not a right to be gone from work.
That's exactly right.
So that is an important distinction.
Right.
I get not just with parental leave policies, but in other conversations too. We end up going round and round sometimes.
So
on that, FMLA is job protection. right? You can be out of work and have a job to come back to. It does not impact pay decisions.
That's right. And I would add to, of course, there's other state laws that provide unpaid leave for those reasons as well. Same is true.
Yeah.
And not to add further confusion, but your question raises a third really, really important point that employers need to be aware of when they're writing these policies, and that is there are several states now, right, Rebecca? And I know you've recently been
12 or so.
Been putting together a chart of all of them
Yeah.
that have state programs in place that provide essentially a paid parental leave benefit through the state. They call it could be disability pay, it could be paid family time, or paid family leave, okay? And so for an employer, for an organization that has employees in any of those states, they need to be thinking about how they're going to coordinate this benefit, this pay that they're providing through this policy with those state plans.
I think it's okay to craft a parental leave policy, which again talks about when we will pay.
Yes.
Right after a child comes into your life. To craft a policy where here is the total amount of benefit of pay, but it will be offset by other benefits you may receive for the same event in your life, be it state parental leave pay, be it STD. I mean, how do you think about that?
I think about, yes, I think that's right. And that's how I've been writing the policies. It of course takes some thought to decide how we're going to work those offsets. But every paid parental leave policy, in my opinion, should speak to whether an employee is eligible for the benefit under the policy if they're also eligible for a benefit under a state plan or program. And notice I said every policy, okay? And that's because even if this organization doesn't have employees in one of the 12 states with those programs right now, they're coming, right? This is a very emerging area of the law in states. More and more states are continuing to pass them. So if you're writing a policy now, let's just make sure it addresses that.
And there was a push at one time under the Trump administration, actually, for a federal program just like that.
Yeah.
And I don't want to sidetrack this podcast into discussions of those programs. So it's basically like unemployment insurance is what it is.
Correct.
Except instead of being unemployed, you are out temporarily because a child has joined your family. But the concept is largely the same. So folks that are not in those states that are not familiar with this concept at all, that's what it is. It's becoming more popular. And so, yes, you should have an offset in your policy.
In your policy. And then, of course, your HR representatives are going to have to be armed with the information of knowing who's eligible for benefits under what program, et cetera.
Let's talk about other sources of money for people that are not at work. I get this question when we're dealing with parental leave policies. Folks want to know how to coordinate with PTO.
Okay, so I do not typically see a paid parental leave policy require employees to use available PTO before they're eligible for the paid parental leave benefit, largely because that really just waters down what the paid parental leave benefit is. If you're telling employees it's only available to folks who use up all of their PTO, the impact of the benefit is much less. Right.
Practically speaking, people will make darn sure to burn up their PTO
That's right.
before their maternity leave. Or
That's right.
Look what I just did.
That's
before
right.
their parental leave starts, right? But that is, I mean, these leave policies, if you're going to be expanding beyond what you have right now, there will probably be a financial impact on the business.
Sure.
Right? And so when that happens, and when you're in the conference room presenting this, there were 100% people saying, how can we get the total cost to the business down? Yes, we want to do this, we want to support our employees, retention, et cetera, but what are ways we can do that without having the significant financial impact? So a suggestion like that is often raised. I've heard it almost every time, so that would be the response.
My response would be, certainly that's an option, but it does really water down what the policy is trying to accomplish, or the benefit is trying to accomplish. So.
Yep, I agree.
Okay. All right. Well, we have a few minutes left, and my suggestion would be, why don't we run through what else? What are the other things that HR professionals should be thinking about as they're putting together their paid parental leave policy. Rebecca, do you have
Perfect.
anything in mind?
I do, right in front of me. If you give me a moment. Okay, so we need to make sure that we talk about the FMLA and the policy and how that coordination will take place, right?
Yep.
That the time is going to run concurrently with FMLA, right? I mean, I suppose a generous employer could say it runs after the FMLA protected time runs out, but most employers are going to want it to run concurrently with FMLA protected leave.
Right.
Okay.
And on that note, what I would say is, under the FMLA, okay, for bonding time specifically, employees have a right to take that anytime in the first year of the birth of the child.
Okay, this is a very important concept.
Anytime with, okay, so.
6 months after the birth of the child, for instance,
Sure.
an employee is still entitled to FMLA bonding time.
For only to bond with a child.
Right.
But you could, in your paid parental leave policy, say, if you want the pay to bond with the child, you have to take it right immediately after the birth or the adoption or foster care placement of the child. So think about whether you want to do that. Also, under the FMLA, we don't have to allow employees to take bonding time intermittently. Okay.
What?
So we
Boy,
can
that's music.
also
People's ears.
say in the paid parental leave policy that it must be taken continuously if that's what the employer wants to do. Again, these are things to think through, and whatever the answer is should be in the policy.
Sure. And by the way, if folks want to allow intermittent leave under their parental leave policy and pay for it, they can. They just don't have to. It's just one of those things to think about and make a decision about, right? Like, for instance, some of it can be continuous, and then for the first month or two after, they might want to allow some intermittent for those things that pop up when new parents are returning to work and trying to sort out how to make that happen.
What else?
I think we need to think about what words in the policy we should include in the policy that will trigger the leave, right? Because it's not always the birth of the child. When we talk about foster care placements or adoptions, right, what we need to be careful with the terminology we use.
That's right. And in fact, I've worked quite a bit with our family lawyers here to really get right the language in particular for adoption, because many policies I see just say it commences after the adoption of the child. Well, the reality is, with regard to adoption, the child is often temporarily placed with a new family, and that legal adoption doesn't occur until quite some time later. Okay, so for example, you could use the words temporary placement of the child for adoption instead of adoption itself.
What about job protection? And again, not to bring up the FMLA again, but FMLA.
Why not?
I know. If only we could talk about the FMLA
not,
all day,
Rebecca?
every day. Yes, you would be happy. Our clients would not. But FMLA, of course, comes with job protection, but this is not FMLA. No one's requiring you to have a parental leave policy. So it doesn't have to include job protection, does it?
It doesn't have to, and in fact, there may be, remember, if it's running concurrently with FMLA, then it really would, in effect, provide job protection. But you may have employees that are eligible for the paid parental leave benefit who aren't yet eligible for FMLA leave, right? Or aren't in a classification. So that's right. So think through, if FMLA is not available to this employee, is the paid parental leave going to include the same or similar job protection and benefit continuation? And again, the employer, the business, can make that decision, but it should say so in the policy, whatever it is.
So back to PTO for a second. We discussed that we're not going to, most clients would choose not to require a parent to burn through their PTO, right, at the beginning of the parental leave. But what about PTO accrual during parental leave?
Are you going to let folks continue to accrue PTO during, again, something to think about. That's up to the business to make the decision. I would probably say look at what you do for other similar leaves or time off work, and do you accrue PTO during those, then you probably want to accrue PTO during paid parental leave as well.
Another issue that comes up a lot in parental leave policies is when employees are bringing children into their home or adopting them who are not infants. For instance, a new spouse's children. It's not unusual for a step-parent to adopt a spouse's child who might be an infant, might be 17, right? So again, no right or wrong, but it's something to think about. And
think about any exclusions, for example, you want to make. I've seen several policies have exactly that exclusion in it, that the paid parental leave does not apply to adoption of a new spouse's children, for example. Again, not right or wrong, and are there other exceptions you want to make? I looked at a policy recently that I thought had a very good ad, which is making clear that if you give birth to or adopt multiple children at the same time, right, you don't get an exponential amount of paid parental leave, right? So having twins is the same amount. Adopting 4 siblings is the same amount. Again, unless the employer wants to make an exception there. Also, think about whether the organization wants to limit how many times this benefit can be used or how frequently it can be used. For example, once every 18 months or X number of times within a 5-year, whatever it is, because we certainly can limit that if we want to.
Particularly with foster parents, you can imagine, right, someone becoming eligible over and over. In case people were wondering, how is that even physically possible? That's how it's physically possible. The last, I think, real big ticket item here is who is eligible for parental leave. Is it on day 1 of employment? Or is it only for people that have successfully completed 90 days, maybe a full year, maybe people who are otherwise entitled to FMLA? I've seen that, right? So if you're entitled to bonding time under FMLA, then that will trigger our parental leave
And what job classification as well? Is it going to be your full-time employees, your part-time employees, your casuals, your so think through that. And then finally, last
I thought I had the final.
Last piece of advice, okay,
last word.
I would encourage thought about whether employees can bank paid parental leave that they don't use, for example, right? If a parent doesn't use their full entitlement, thank you, Rebecca, can they bank it or not? And then, of course, whether it's paid upon termination of employment. Under many state laws, you've got to say, if you are not going to pay it, you've got to say that in the policy. So,
perfect. Well, this was so helpful to a lot of people.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Sarah.
Have a great day.
You too.